Welcome to Property People, the show for anyone with a passion or interest in property. From design, build, purchase, sale, and everything in between, this show is for you. I'm your host, Andrew Radigan, and I'm the director of Radigan Real Estate, an agency that helps clients buy and sell property in Ireland over €500,000. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy. Welcome back to another episode. It's Andrew Radigan here from Radigan Real Estate, and we have Darragh Lynch from Darragh Lynch Architects for our second episode, where we're going to be talking about another element of architecture and design that will hopefully drive value for people. You're very welcome, Darragh.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Good to be here.
Great to have you again. So basically, we're going to cover another element of property or the property process that most people mightn't necessarily take into account when they're doing the initial build, and it's almost takes a pivotal role, but it plays a background to what people see as the all show, the design, the steak versus the sizzle. So in terms of retrofitting, instead of doing a new build, I mean, people have property, they want to maximize the space or make it more fit for purpose. Why might someone, what would be involved in retrofitting?
Yeah, so the primary reason for retrofitting is for your own comfort. A lot of people have been sold retrofitting as payback. So if you buy a solar panel, it'll pay for itself in 5 years. Actually, retrofitting is all to do with your comfort and the quality of the air in the house. In my opinion, it is a lot less to do with payback.
Right. Okay. So you're not doing it for financial gain. You're doing it for a different way of living, a different way to feel.
Being healthier actually in your own house fundamentally.
And also change of circumstances, I'm sure happens to us all. Yeah. And we'll keep it very simple this week, folks. We're just going to ask some simple questions and Darragh's going to give some simple answers. If anyone does have any other questions, they're more than welcome to touch base, and his details will be in the show notes as well. So on to question number 2. Tell us a bit about the various elements of retrofitting. So what do people usually plan or expect when it comes to it?
So when you're designing any building these days, we take a fabric first approach. So you want to make the heat loss of your building as low as possible, so that the amount of heat you put into your building is as small as possible. So there's 3 bits you need to consider. There's insulation. Everyone always thinks of that one first. There's air tightness is the second one. Most people haven't come across that one yet, but the combination of air tightness and insulation together is better than the effect of either one on its own. It has a kind of a multiplier effect. And then the third one, then, because you're airtight, you need a ventilation system. You need fresh air in the building.
Right.
So they're the 3 ugly sisters of retrofit.
Right. So it's the triple threat, and people, ignore one at your peril kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit about the first one. So you mentioned insulation. So start off.
So look, this is really easy. This is like wrapping a warm woolly jacket around you. So in terms of your floor, most people will have a concrete slab. You'll want 200 mil of dense insulation boards under your slab. If you have a raised access floor in your house, again you'll want at least 200 mil of insulation right the way across the floor of the house. In terms of the wall, the easiest way to insulate a cavity wall is to inject beads, but that, depending on the width of your cavity, it mightn't give you enough. So you can insulate then on the inside of the wall, which is dry lining. That's cheaper, but you lose some space inside. And then there is external wall insulation, where you insulate on the outside of the wall. That's more expensive, but you don't touch you've no decorative costs, and you're not making the room smaller. You're also wrapping the insulation there on the outside, so you don't have any things called a thermal bridge. A thermal bridge is like a hole in your jumper. It's a weak point where you get a disproportionate heat loss at that point because it's a cold patch. And you don't want thermal bridges because they're a condensation risk. And if you get condensation, you're going to get mold growth, and now you don't have a healthy house anymore.
And then from an insulation point of view, when people are thinking insulation, we all think the old kind of, you get the old the fabric that cuts you. I can't remember.
Yeah, the fiberglass.
Fiberglass, where you take your life in your hands when you do it. When people look at the different types of insulation, can they do one or two that work together, or is it an all or nothing approach? So you might have someone that mightn't necessarily be able to do the external, but could do the beads instead of the dry lining, or vice versa.
Yeah. So when it comes to the wall, you can do a little bit of everything, but it's always better to put your money in one place and do it right, rather than mix and match. And then where the mineral wool comes in is your roof. So most people insulate along the ceiling line rather than the roof line. So you need about 400 mil of quilted insulation, either rock wool or mineral wool or fiberglass. Fiberglass is really awful to work with, but you can get sheep's wool, which is lovely. You can get cellulose. There's lots of other, and you get wood fiber, or there's lots of different more sustainable insulation materials. But it's very important to make sure that if the roof needs to be ventilated, that you still ventilate the roof. It's very important that if you have air ducts, that the air ducts are on the warm side of the insulation. So because if they're on the cold side of the insulation, you're going to get condensation. When you get condensation, you're going to get fungal growth, and now you've fungal spores coming through your ventilation ducts, which isn't a good idea. Okay,
well, we won't jump that far. We don't scare people yet. I think most people, when they think of insulation, they just think of the old adage of what they would have seen in a house when they break through a wall. But that's interesting to see. And then the second part of that would be air tightness. What role would air tightness play once you've taken the step with insulation? Yeah, so what air tightness is basically is you're stopping air leaking out of the building. So you're burning gas or oil to heat up the air inside your building. It's cold outside, it's warm inside, and nature abhors a vacuum, and the air will jet out these little gaps between the window and the wall, between the wall and the floor, between the wall and the roof. So what air tightness is sealing up all those gaps. So if you think about waterproofing, this is airproofing your house. So you're sealing up all those gaps where you get heat loss. So what it looks like, it's made from any wet construction, so a concrete slab or cement plaster on the wall, that's airtight. Any of that wet construction is airtight. So, but if you have wet plaster on the wall and a wet slab, there's still a gap between the two. So you use tape or goo, silicone goo to seal the gap between the wall and the floor. And then when you get to the place where the first floor is hitting your wall, that's normally not plastered. So you need either an airtight membrane that's sealed against all the things, or you can get airtight paint. And then on the ceiling of the building, you need an airtight membrane the whole way across. The airtight membrane needs to be on the warm side of the insulation. That's really important. Okay. It needs to be continuous. And as soon as you start putting holes in it for fixing light fittings or anything else, it's not doing its job anymore. Right. So when you have an airtight building and you make a hole, you just have to seal the hole. It's not difficult to seal the hole. There's tapes and goos and stuff that you can get to seal the hole, but you need to be conscious of that. And the combination of insulation and air tightness has a multiplier effect. It really improves the performance of the house. So it's kind of like an energy version of compound interest, where you're not just doing one thing and hoping for the best, you're adding that extra opportunity. And what was the third one? Tell us a bit about that.
Well, the third one is ventilation. So when you airtight your house, you can no longer rely on all these leaks to give you fresh air. So you need a ventilation system to provide you with fresh air in the house. Now, because it's airtight, you're now in control of the ventilation. So you can have an efficient ventilation system. The simplest version is natural ventilation, where you're just opening the windows. And then there's extract vents that are powered by the stack effect. The next layer up would be demand controlled ventilation. So that's letting air into the rooms that need it most, and sucking the air out of the wet rooms, the toilets, and the utility rooms, and
then the high moisture points that most
people think of. So any of the smelly stale air gets sucked out first, and it draws the fresh air through the habitable rooms. That's the idea of the demand control ventilation. And then the next level up from that is mechanical heat recovery. So that's a fully mechanical system where you're putting fresh air into every room and you're taking stale air out of every room, except when the stale air gets pumped out of the building, it transfers the heat into the fresh air coming in, so you get warmed fresh air into the building, and that they're very efficient systems.
And obviously, as you go up each layer, requirements are different, and the standard for the air tightness is different. So the old way of opening a window and having a drafty room was actually natural ventilation.
Yeah,
and that was
exactly.
by virtue over the years what we'd all know.
Yeah,
Is
and as you go up the levels, there's increased costs, there's more ducts, there's more complications, there's more maintenance, so you have to clean the filters and all that kind of stuff. You need to be careful of it, but you absolutely need a decent ventilation system if you're going to have an airtight fabric on the house.
Yeah, but they'd be the three key components that when someone's looking at it, they're not just kind of like anything, they're not just attending to one part, they play.
You need to do all three
together.
You need to do all three, yeah.
And they also then, depending on the level someone wants, so someone might just want to bring it up a couple of notes or notches on the energy rating belt, or someone might want to go to the tippy top, and the price you pay for that is the standard is higher and the execution is different.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So we're on to our next question. We're going to talk a little bit about airtightness some more. So I mean, we see a lot about new builds, and I think you see a big prevalence in people wanting to buy something that's built to a new standard. Obviously there's a price to be paid for both in terms of the site value and the price you pay for a property nowadays. What role does kind of energy and airtightness play in those kind of properties now? I know it's not retrofitting, but it's kind of along the same lines.
Yeah, so when you have an efficient fabric, so when you get the fabric of the building right, well then all the energy that you need to put in then afterwards is reduced. Mm-hmm. So the heating systems that you tack onto your house now can be simpler. They can be low temperature heating systems. Mm-hmm. So the way the national policy is going on this is we have to get to carbon neutral by 2050. So we're going to create a green electricity grid, and we're going to get rid of gas and oil from our house heating systems, and we're going to introduce electricity. So that's either direct electricity or a heat pump. So if you have a good insulated fabric, if you're airtight, and if you have a ventilation system, now you can just top up the extra energy with a heat pump or some other low temperature system. The passive house standard gives you so much insulation that actually you only require a very small added extra heat to heat your house. So you don't need a conventional heating system with conventional radiators and so on. So you don't have to have that. So that's where the passive standard comes from.
So it's kind of showing a big difference between the old adage of you come home from work or school, you fire up the gas-fired central heating, you are freezing for an hour, and then after an hour and a half you're too hot. You're trying to create an ambient temperature.
Well, I'll give you an example of that. So do you remember The Beast from the East in 2018?
Yes.
So that was in March, but there was a real cold snap in January of that year. I can't remember a cold snap like that. There was no snow, but there was minus 15 degree temperatures outside. And a client of mine had just moved into their house after Christmas. They had a glitch with their plumbing. They called up the plumber. He came around to the house on a Friday evening. He turned off the boiler. He fixed the glitch in 5 minutes, and he left. And he forgot to turn the boiler back on. When he left on a Friday evening, it was minus 15 outside, and it was 21.5 degrees inside the house. On Sunday afternoon, they asked themselves, is it my imagination, or is the house a little bit cold? Okay, so they had no heating on for 2 days, and they didn't notice for 2 days with minus 15 outside. Okay, so when the plumber came back on Monday morning, the temperature in the house was 17.5 degrees. So over 3 days, the temperature dropped by 3 degrees, with the most extreme cold outside that I can remember in my memory. And that's what getting the fabric right does. So you actually need very little additional energy to heat the house, and it cools down very slowly. So you don't get these peaks and troughs of getting hot, heating up the house, and then getting really cold. It stays at a static, comfortable temperature all the time. That's what you're trying to achieve with the retrofit.
Yeah, and although it's a very extreme story, which is obviously something we'd all remember, it is a very simple example to show that that's the idea. But we're all used to in Irish society, like who left the hot press on? Obviously, that's I think it's still punishable by death. And then
the immersion.
The immersion, and then you fire up the heating, and then after that you're kind of like you're too hot. You turn it off and you open some windows and you undo the work that you did in the first place. And then after that, so in terms of ventilation, like obviously it's great to have the heat and great to have heat retention, but ventilation is something that probably people only see as like, you know, a hole in the wall that lets a bit of air out unbeknownst to them. But there's obviously a deeper and more important role it plays.
Yeah, so like the Department of Education have CO2 alarms in their classrooms now as a test during COVID. So when they close all the windows, CO2 goes up, everyone gets sleepy and dopey, that kind of sluggish feeling, you know. And you open the windows and the CO2 alarm goes off, the fresh air comes in, and everyone wakes up a little bit. So, CO2 is actually not good for you. Carbon dioxide.
You heard it here first. CO2 is not good for you guys.
Don't do it at home, kids. So, air quality is something that hasn't really been targeted very much in the building regs. But it's actually very important. It's associated with asthma and poor air quality inside your house and other respiratory problems and all the rest of it. So the ventilation system provides you with that fresh air that you need to stay alive, to stay fresh. Yeah.
And obviously the price you pay for making a property more, and it's obviously just so people are aware of it, more efficient, is that there's then on the other side, it's almost like a give and a take. You're taking away that draft and that kind of making it more efficient. But by virtue of that, you then have to create an artificial version of what you had in the first place.
Now you're in control of it. If you try to put if you try to put a ventilation system into an unairtight house, it'll just suck the air through the wall beside the fan. It won't work at all. It'll just tumble the air around beside where the fan is, where what you want is a whole house designed ventilation system that provides fresh air in all the habitable rooms and sucks the air out of all the wet rooms, the bathrooms and toilets and utility rooms.
Which shows you it's a fantastic advantage for people retrofitting, looking at the benefits of what technology can do outside of the design part of the process. So we'll keep moving on to the next part of our question. So in terms of assuming that they need to buy the best up-to-date tech or appliances or certain things they've seen when they're shopping for the part, obviously the building part of the job, what kind of role does that play in kind of value versus efficiency versus productivity, and also how does it suit?
When you get the fabric of your house right, you have a heating load for space and for water, and then you have electrical load for all the gear in your house. Solar panels are a great way of sustainably offsetting the electrical load. And if you're heating your house with electricity through a heat pump, well, now you can be carbon neutral. If you have enough solar panels that are generating all that, now you're offsetting, or you're generating sustainable energy to supply all your energy needs. One of the difficulties we have in Ireland is you can't, the solar panels create more energy during the day and during the summer when we don't need it, and less energy at night and in winter when we do need it. So you need the solar panels to be able to export their energy to the grid as almost like a storage battery, and then to be able to borrow from the grid when you need it, like a battery. But we don't have that facility in Ireland. It has to happen, I think. So it has to allow for microgeneration to be able to export to the grid and buy the energy from the grid back when you need it.
And do you see that happening?
I think it has to happen. There has to, if we're going to be serious about getting to carbon neutrality by 2050, all of these things need to happen, and they need to happen very quickly.
So it can't be a case of theory, it needs to be execution, get on with it and encourage people. But it also needs to be an incentive for someone who puts the effort, the time and the money into it. To not just be doing it for the good of the... And
I guess there's other elements to sustainability as well, from a global point of view, to the kind of materials you use, offsetting the lack of greenness. So you put a green roof on your room on your roof to help birds and insects and give them a place to be where your house used to be, to replace some of that biodiversity. So there's water usage, there's the transport impact of where you build. So if you're a one-off house in the middle of the countryside and you're driving everywhere, that has an impact on your. It could be the most sustainable house in the world, but if you're get there back, it takes its toll as well. So it's trying to find a balance, a practical balance between all those things.
It's also probably incentivizing people to actually take a serious look at doing it, rather than thinking that, well, that's not for us. But then also the practicality of educating people on seeing that it's the role you play. There's no point in having the world's most efficient house, like you said, if it takes the equivalent of 25 cement trucks and factories to get it to that.
And actually what we've done in Ireland is we've made our houses twice as efficient, but twice as big. Yeah. So in fact, we haven't made any saving at all.
So it kind of cancels itself out. And most people probably don't realise that.
No.
Especially on a macro level. Micro level, they think they're doing their part.
Yeah.
But macro, they don't.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, well, on to the next one. So we're on to our next question, which is, in terms of the benefits, what do people expect versus what is possible? So obviously people have great ideas, much like you look in England and someone says, I'm going to get paid for energy and surplus and I'm going to be going around in shorts and t-shirt. What's the kind of expectation versus the reality?
Well, when I was in Ballymun Regeneration, we did a pilot project where we retrofitted 4 social housing houses. And there was a kind of a light bulb moment for me when we finished the work. Everyone in the houses suddenly realised, oh my God, the house is like twice as warm and the boiler is only on half the time. This is like, it wasn't so much to do with saving money, although that was a real issue for some of them, but the comfort of the house was a huge benefit for them. Particularly there was an older couple. It made a massive difference to them because they were freezing in their house. And unfortunately in Ballymun and places like Ballymun, people reached that do I eat or heat question before the
fuel poverty they called it, wasn't it?
Yeah. So that was a kind of an example of it's not for the payback from the solar panel or the gizmo I just bought. It's actually a more comfortable house. That's actually what you're looking for, and a house that stays comfortable during the whole day, and the heating system is just puffing a little bit of energy in during the day just to top it up. It's not like being on all the time going gangbusters. So and so that's what people should expect. They should also expect better air quality, and that manifests itself differently for different people, obviously, but they should have better quality of fresh air in their house, and that it shouldn't be associated with massive heat loss as well.
Yeah, so it's not an either or. And also I suppose it's the most simple thing we've all seen, which is quality of our air and quality of our water. And it's things you can take for granted, but if you get that right, you're topping it up rather than taking extreme measures on either side. And it's also knowing. I think some people, when you get into a room and you say, God, that room was awful hot yesterday, but it was sunny yesterday. As opposed to, well, the house is consistently a certain way, and you top it up or allow for a little bit of a lowering in it. So moving along to the next one, what role do grants play? Because I think some people might have the misconception that, the government are going to throw you a wad of cash and it sorts itself out, or equally that those you engage professionally will do all the legwork for you. How would you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah, so SEII have really good grants. They've been in place for a long time. They're fairly straightforward. The customer needs to make the application. So the building professional, the design team don't do it. The customer does it. You need to get a BR cert done before the application and then after the application to prove that you've made a difference. And then there's a set amount for each measure that you get. So there's almost like a shopping list of measures, and you pick off and you get a set amount for each measure you put in. It's not going to move the dial for people. It's not going to allow people put in a huge amount of measures that they ordinarily wouldn't have done, but it does help. So on a typical retrofit where you're kind of doing everything in the house, you could maybe get $3,000 or $3,500, something like that, depending on what was in the house beforehand. But it's that kind of realm of stuff. It certainly is a help.
Softens the blow.
Absolutely, yeah. But it's not gonna move the dial and allow you to do things that you couldn't imagine doing in the first place.
I know what you mean. And on a slight side note, as a part of that question, for those who are looking to engage something like that at the moment, at what stage or at what part of the process should they apply or explore what they need to do for those kind of grants, rather than leaving it too late and losing it?
Yeah. So early as possible is the answer to that.
Okay,
so
you can't be too early. You can just...
Yeah. So you need to get an SEI approved installer to do all the work. So when you engage with your contractor, he needs to find a SEI approved installer who's able to certify the work in the correct way.
Okay.
So you need to have your application in place before they're appointed, so that they can fill in their part of the process and get the grant.
I think that's good for people to know, because they might leave it on the long finger and not realise the role that plays. So basically, before engaging someone at that level, you need to explore your options, have it ready to go, and make them aware that this is your plan, rather than they put them up on the roof and then you say, would you mind signing that?
Exactly. And also it's good to have the application process in place before you send out your tenders to your contractors, so your contractor knows what he has to do.
And it'll do away with any time wasting or missing out on the wrong person. That's a good piece of information for people. So on to our next question. So, I mean, in terms of, we've had discussions before in the past about, and I know you're a big believer in obviously our footprint that we leave on this earth, and the role that we play in kind of acting as custodians. And obviously building design is beautiful, and aesthetically things can be pleasing, and there's fantastic feats of engineering and design, but obviously they all play a role in what we're doing to the earth and to where we live. What is your take on the impact of material use, building, even on a social level? People who probably don't necessarily take it into account. They think, well, there's a beautiful property or a beautiful commercial building gone up on X street, and they don't see the ramifications of that. And then at home they're putting a couple of cans in the recycling bin. They think they're doing their bit. What are your thoughts on that?
So overall, from a global point of view, buildings are associated with 40% of our carbon footprint. 40%. So, like at the moment, for example, there's a huge pressure on farmers to come up with carbon savings to meet the national targets. Farming is associated with 30%. So of the 40%, 30 is associated with operating buildings, and 29% actually is operating buildings, and 11% is the construction of buildings. So I, as a building professional, I can impact global warming far more effectively than by choosing carbon neutral or less carbon intensive materials than recycling my rubbish. I mean, I have the capacity to really make a big difference to the global climate issue. By 2050, we need to get to carbon neutrality as a planet. If we don't get to that point, the temperature of the Earth is going to increase by 2 degrees from a certain point they set. If you get over that 2 degree limit, what's going to happen is you're going to have feedback loops that are going to be impossible to step back from. So an example of that would be, the ice caps are going to melt. You're going to have more dark ocean absorbing more energy from the sun, less ice to reflect less energy from the sun. The melting of the ice caps is going to speed up. The Siberian tundra, which has tons of bog and methane in it, is going to melt. All that methane is going to be released into the atmosphere. Methane is 20 times worse than carbon dioxide in terms of global warming capacity. There's all sorts of nightmare scenarios. And the other thing, as an example, would be the Himalayan glaciers would melt. So you get massive flooding, will wash out the north of India, and then there'd be no rainfall. The Ganges would dry up. I'm exaggerating, but only slightly. I mean, the feedback loops here start other natural processes that will feed the climate warming thing. We're talking about millions of lives. We're talking about COVID cubed in terms of the impact on people. The only good thing about COVID I could see was there was this actual global mobilization for the benefit of all mankind. Now, some of that was partisan, but everyone was able to mobilize and do something quickly to make a difference. We have to bring we need NEFIT for climate change. We need someone who's going to make those long-term decisions to get us where we want to go. So when it comes to my job, materials like concrete and steel are incredibly carbon intensive. In the chemistry of the materials themselves, they produce twice as much carbon as the material. So for every ton of concrete, we're producing 2 tons of carbon, and the same for steel. We have to come up with different ways of building that minimizes the use of those materials, and they're brilliant materials, so they're incredibly useful, but we can't be using them with no awareness of the impact they have on the globe. So things like underground car parks. I don't think we should be building underground car parks. I think because a huge amount of concrete in those things. So, and they encourage people to drive. So the double whammy. I think the planners should be saying you shouldn't build any underground car parks, and we should be getting the train or the bus, because that's fundamentally more sustainable. So there are alternatives. So there's timber. So timber's a great material. So it's structural. We can grow it. We can replace it. And in the growing of the timber, we're sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But we need to have a good supply of construction timber.
Materials.
Yeah. And one of the things I often think of in terms of the farmers, again, in terms of reducing the herd, I think a sweet spot would be to reduce the national herd, to eat less meat and grow more materials that we can use for building. So there's things like hemp. Hemp is the cannabis plant, but it's also used for making rope and jute. It's a very strong fibre. And in Ballymun, we used hempcrete to make the walls of a building. So it's a structural material and an insulative material at all the one in the one go. And it's completely sustainable. And when you're demolishing the building, you can crumble it down again, mix it up again, and reuse it again. And
from a life cycle point of view, would it have the similar qualities to cement in terms of how long it would last and durability and everything else? Yeah,
so it wouldn't be quite as hard wearing as concrete. You need to keep it dry. It's a bit like a timber house. I mean, there are timber houses in the States hundreds of years old because they're designed well and they're kept dry and they're maintained. So it's,
relative to the material. But then I suppose when you're doing your part, it's much like the airtightness and the insulation we talked about. There's a price to be paid for taking a different approach that's more efficient. But then that becomes a far better option than the alternative, which is catastrophe and whatever.
And I guess the other material we need to focus on, back to the earlier part of this conversation about insulation. So a lot of our Kingspan boards are made out of petrochemicals. They are carbon intensive materials. There are sustainable alternatives to those. So there's wood fibre insulation, there's cellulose, there's sheep's wool. There's lots of, now those materials tend to be more expensive because they aren't established industry norms. And we need to move the dial. We need to be encouraging those guys to reduce the cost of their product and to use more of those instead of the petrochemical ones. Now, the Kingspan stuff is really good for roofs or for foundations where you have wet conditions. The sustainable stuff isn't, so we're going to need some of that stuff. We can't do without it. But in situations where we can use alternatives, we should be using alternatives. There's an alternative for concrete called GGBS, which is ground granulated blast furnace slag. So when you make steel, you throw in a whole load of limestone to iron ore to absorb the impurities in the iron ore. Okay. When you make concrete, you throw in a load of limestone and heat it up to make concrete. So the blast furnace slag, the leftover from the steel furnace, is pretty close to cement. So you can take that stuff, grind it down, and you make GGBS, which is a material that works almost the same as concrete.
Wow.
When I was in Ballymun, we specified that all the concrete blocks have 50% GGBS in them. There was no problem making them. The problem is that people don't ask for them. We need to encourage people to choose the better material.
That actually flows to my next kind of question. My final question would be, it's important, obviously, we all play a role, and I suppose people need to see the impact that they could have rather than thinking, as we all do as individuals, sure, what can I do? When someone's taking on a project to retrofit, is there a certain way that they can, almost like requesting organic food, has it become acceptable or the norm for someone who is very mindful of their carbon footprint to be able to put that in the tender? So for example, XYZ Space Design must use 70% or 60% contributable natural products in the build. Is that something that is kind of prevalent now, or is it still a bit of an outlier where people are making an effort but they're kind of one in every 100 clients that actually ask?
They're very few. I mean, they're right at the bleeding edge of all of this, where we need to move the majority middle towards us. So architects and people in the construction industry have started groups like Construction Declares and Architect Declares. So they're actively promoting using sustainable materials with their clients, and they've declared that they're going to do this with their clients. And that doesn't mean we're forcing our clients to do it, obviously, but I think when people understand the difference between, and it's actually one of the things that's makes a difference is the inflation in the construction industry at the moment. It's actually evened the pitch a little bit in terms of the additional extra cost for some of these sustainable things. So it's actually easier now to specify the more sustainable material because there isn't that cost differential anymore.
So it's not as stark or frightening a difference where you think you're going to go over budget, because with it being such a volatile product market or at the moment, it's almost
and most sustainable things are made from waste, which is, I guess the other thing just to mention is a notion called circularity, and that's when you if you take there's a carpet tile company who don't sell you the carpet tiles, they lease you the carpet tiles, and when you're finished with the carpet tiles, you come out, they take away your carpet tiles and they turn them into more carpet tiles and they put down new carpet tiles. So they've designed the product so that it can be deconstructed and reused. So they're not looking at using any virgin material anymore. They're just using their old material and reusing their old material again and again. So that's the circular economy. And we're going to have to engage really seriously with that if we're going to hit our targets.
There's probably a huge element of education from people like yourselves that are willing to talk about it. Because I think, like everything, it becomes a tipping point where naturally we all see organic food now in shops and people say, is this organic or whatever? But it's a similar thing where originally someone would have asked for it and they would have been seen as someone who bought one particular item that was organic in one particular shop, whereas now we all have choice. But it's almost then too late when it becomes the norm. A coffee shop on every corner. We need people to really engage with this, ask the questions that they may not have thought to ask, but also the stakeholders in the industry to be able to say, yes, we've built X number of generations on this type of material, but we now know for our grandchildren's children, it can't be like this anymore. And even a fractional difference across a large business can make, or a large market can make a huge difference. It's not just 10% or 20%. It is compounding.
But as a specifier, we can promote these industries that make beautiful products, really good building products, out of waste material, out of sustainable materials, out of healthy materials. When you think about it, a lot of the stuff that we're using there's a lot of petrochemicals in there, phenols and all sorts of nasties.
So I think the takeaway today for people is really take a view to the benefits of the three-pronged approach to air tightness, ventilation, and your insulation. And then also be mindful of materials. So don't just think finish first, think kind of contribution first, and then a good seasoned architect or someone who's willing to do that will marry your want to contribute with the initial design. That's fascinating. Great. Well, I really appreciate that, Darragh. Thank you.
Not at all, Andrew. Thanks very much. Okay.
That's it for another show. If you have any comments, questions, or want to get in touch, I would love to hear from you. If you like what you hear, please feel free to share with colleagues, family, and friends. Until next time, I have been your host, Andrew Rattigan, and you have been listening to Property People.